Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for coming today. Today's talk, The Wonder, is an extension of, I keep forgetting, is an extension of the nutrition program that we had last semester, and we were not able to get the right time for Ellen to be here and present her talk, but she has graciously accepted to do it now. And the topic of her talk is Take a Deep Breath, Nutrition for People with COPD. Ellen is both a registered dietitian and a registered nurse. She received her BS in nursing from Central Florida and her master's in food science and human nutrition from UF. She's a fellow of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and she has worked as the faculty nutritionist with the University of Florida's Pediatric Pulmonary Center since 1990. This is a maternal and child health bureau interdisciplinary leadership training grant. Ellen is co-director of the UFPPC, and as such, she coordinates the grant activities in addition to training students and interns and the provision of continuing education, consultation, and technical assistance. She serves as the lead analyst or consultant for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and has worked on numerous projects including carbohydrate-restricted dietary approaches, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, gestational diabetes, and cystic fibrosis. She's co-author of several reviews on nutrition for people with COPD and has given presentations on this topic at local, state, and national meetings, including the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics annual meeting. Her awards and honors include Outstanding Member of the Year by the Pediatric Nutrition Practice Group of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. She's been the Outstanding Dietitian of the Year by the Florida Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and Outstanding Preceptor of the Year. So please welcome Ellen, and I'm sure you'll enjoy her talk. She's got a wide knowledge of the field of nutrition, so pick her brains after. Thank you, Ellen, for coming.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am so glad to be here.
Hold on, let me.
Okay, yep. Okay. I can speak a little bit louder. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm so glad to be here. I really appreciate Pushpa for the introduction, and she took me to lunch, and I got to see your beautiful facility. It is really gorgeous here. I also want to thank Julie, who is a good friend of mine, who I love dearly, and I'm so happy to be able to see her here working.
I'm gonna switch mics.
Okay.
For some reason, this one's,
It's not so loud.
it's still green, but
Okay.
maybe we'll just get
Okay.
closer.
Is that better? Get closer to me. I don't speak very loudly. Is that better?
We want to hear every word.
Okay. I'll try to speak up. Oh, so if we could, I guess I have to push the button, don't I? Yes. All right. And so this is my advance, right? No. Which do I push, Julie?
To the right.
This one. Okay. So so my name again is Ellen Bowser. I work at the University of Florida, and I'm going to turn this a little bit like that. Is that better? Is that okay? Otherwise, I'm going to run into it. And I am here to talk about nutrition for people with COPD. And as you can see on the slide, this is my mother and my sister on a train trip to Canada for my mom's 80th birthday. I told Julie I wasn't invited, but that's okay, because I was home with little kids. But my mom lived with COPD for many years. And what was unique about this trip was it was a train trip across Canada, and she was on oxygen at the time, although she doesn't have her nasal cannula in this picture, but I was able to get oxygen for her so that she had it on the train and at every stop throughout Canada. So it was really, I guess my point is you can do so many things when you have COPD, and you don't really want it to restrict your life in any way. So I always think of Mom when I think of people with COPD. So what are we going to talk about today? The first thing we're going to do is just talk about COPD a little bit. I don't know how familiar you all are with this subject, so I'm just going to give a brief overview. Then we're going to talk about what I call nutrition in a minute or two. We're going to just do some basic nutrition guidelines. We're going to talk about carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Those are our macronutrients. And we're going to talk about vitamins and minerals, our micronutrients. Then what do we need to do? How do we eat healthy in our environment in general? Then I'm going to move on and talk about some evidence-based nutrition recommendations for people with COPD, a project I was involved with a couple years ago. Some special needs for people with COPD, boosters, and then we're going to have a little quiz. And so, but it'll be an easy quiz. And I'll give all the answers beforehand, mostly. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to say is, what is COPD? And I just want a show of hands of people who are familiar with it or might have a family member or might know someone or might have COPD themselves. And that's okay if you don't. I've given this talk at the Senior Center there's actually a COPD support group in Gainesville. And my talk wasn't, you guys are getting like a higher version of it. That one was a little bit less evidence, a little bit more day to day, but I've been able to incorporate the things I learned from the people with COPD as well as what I've done in the research. So this just gives you an idea probably at how it feels to have COPD, the coughing, the wheezing, but what does that really mean? So what COPD is if you look on the left, is there a pointer here? Do I have a pointer? Okay. I'll try not to blind you. Maybe I'm pushing the wrong button. It's okay. Okay, am I pushing? Is it this one? Okay, it's all right. It's okay, that's fine, that's totally fine. So here on the left, we see healthy lungs. And if you see in the gas exchange in the lung, you've got your bronchial tubes. That's where there's no gas exchange there, but the air just comes in. And then in the alveoli, those are the air sacs. And you can see the arrows moving around because there's gas exchange, and oxygen and carbon dioxide are moving around, exchanging around the capillaries. So those are normal, healthy lungs. With someone with COPD, two things happen. We've got our bronchial tubes get filled up with mucus. You see how much thicker the lines are here because the tubes have a lot of thickness in them because of the increased mucus. And then what you also see are the alveoli, or the air sacs. They're stiffer. There's less room for gas exchange. So we can see on the right, you see all the arrows moving, and on the I guess that's the left. On this side, the healthy lungs, we see a lot of air exchange, and we don't see it as much as lungs who has COPD. So what are the signs and symptoms of COPD? The most common signs or symptoms are cough, shortness of breath, can't take a deep breath, a lot of excess sputum, and wheezing. And so there are really two components to COPD. One is what's known as chronic bronchitis, and that's when those air tubes, you see the healthy on the left, you see how open the lumen or the middle is, so there's lots of area for air to pass through. And then with someone with chronic bronchitis, you see a much narrower airway with a lot of inflammation and excess mucus. So that's the bronchitis part of COPD. In emphysema, that is actually where the alveoli, the little tiny, what we consider to look like grapes, where all that air exchange is going on, those membranes start to break down and the air sacs get very stiff. So someone with COPD generally has a combination of the bronchitis and emphysema. So how do we manage COPD? Lots of treatments. Usually it's medications, inhaled medications to help open up those airways, decrease the inflammation. Pulmonary rehab and physical activity. We want people to be able to have the energy to get up and have a normal life. Oxygen supplementation is very common as people, we know COPD is a progressive disease. That means that it just gets worse over time. And so generally people with COPD as things progress and their lung function becomes worse, they may require oxygen, like my mom. It made her life a little bit complicated, but it made her quality of life much, much better. And she was able to go up in the mountains in Canada with her small little oxygen tank. Surgery doesn't occur very often, but I guess it's an option if they needed to remove part of the lung. There are lifestyle changes that we want to do. You want to stay away from smoke and air pollution. I mean, really, we all need to stay away from smoke and air pollution. Ongoing care is really important, taking your medications, getting your flu shots, getting your COVID-19 vaccine, and being able to monitor your activities and symptoms. If someone's getting more fatigued or more short of breath, chances are they need to go back to their provider to see what's going on and to prepare that there may be times when you get sicker. The common cold might bring somebody with COPD into the hospital just because their lungs don't have a lot of reserve. And I forgot to mention early on, but actually 15 million adults in the United States have COPD. And the thought is that many people have it and don't realize it. So it's important to, if you don't go to your healthcare provider routinely, to get followed up routinely, particularly if we see it in people that were previous smokers. But you can have COPD and not be a smoker, and you could have been a smoker and maybe not get COPD, although you're more likely to if you're a smoker. Okay, so now moving on to nutrition in a minute or two. The first thing I'm going to talk about are the macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And then again, we're going to talk about our vitamins and minerals next. So carbohydrates, everybody knows them, right? We think about them all the time. We had a lunch discussion about carbs, right? Are carbs good? Are carbs bad? They're both. They're 4 calories per gram. They're a really important source of energy. Our body runs on carbohydrates. And really our general recommendations are you want about half of your daily intake of calories from carbs. Whole grains, fruits, and vegetables are the best source of carbohydrates, but we certainly, cereals, other things like that are a good source of carbs. Proteins is our next macronutrient that we're going to talk about in our nutrition in a minute or two. There are 4 calories per gram, so carbohydrates and proteins have the same number of calories. We need our proteins for muscle strength and for muscle building, but it's also important to know that proteins are needed to fight infections. What do we use? What does our body produce to fight infections? Antibodies, and antibodies are made of protein. So if we don't get enough protein, we're not going to be able to fight off infections. The best sources of proteins are meats, eggs, beans, seafood, dairy, and tofu. And the last but not least are fats. They're 9 calories per gram, so we get more calories per gram from fats than carbohydrate or proteins. We need fats for energy, and we need fats for the absorption of vitamins, particularly our fat-soluble vitamins. The best sources are butters, oils, avocado, and we generally consider the healthiest types of fats, those which are called unsaturated, and those are liquid at room temperature. So if you think about the oils that we have in our cabinet, like olive oil and safflower oil and soy oil, they're all liquid at room temperature. So things like lard and butter, those are solid at room temperature. So we want to go with those healthier fats, those that are liquid at room temperature. Okay. So this is just a standard kind of idea of how we want to divide up our macronutrients on a daily basis. And you can see that, remember I said about half of your daily intake should be carbohydrates. This graph actually says 45 to 65%. So it gives you a range. A low carb diet is really considered to be less than 40%. And they're much lower carb diets. We talked about that at lunch today too, but we're not gonna go there today. About 10 to 35% of your calories should come from protein, and about 20 to 35% of your calories should come from fat. So it gives you a wide range, but just to give you an idea of how we divide up that pie of our macronutrients. Okay, we're moving on now. We're going to talk about vitamins. Vitamins are substances that are required for the body to function, and vitamins come from either plant or animal sources. They are considered to be organic. There are fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. The fat-soluble vitamins are A, D, E, and K, and that means that they're actually stored in the body. So our fat-soluble vitamins are stored in our adipose tissue, or other places too. Liver stores fat-soluble vitamins as well. We call them fat-soluble because you need fat to absorb the fat-soluble vitamins. So if you don't have fat in your diet, you're not going to be able to absorb and store your fat-soluble vitamins. I have D highlighted because we're going to talk about D a little bit later on. Water-soluble vitamins are vitamins like vitamin C, the Bs, folate. There are other water-soluble vitamins. Those are not stored in the body. So those, if you have excess amounts of water-soluble vitamins, they just are excreted through the body in urine. So people who often take a lot of water-soluble vitamins and are losing a lot of them in their urine, people will joke and say it's like the most expensive urine in the world if you're spending a lot of money on water-soluble vitamins and just having them pass through. Vitamin C is highlighted because we're going to talk about vitamin C as well. So let's not forget our minerals. Our minerals are found in soil and other components. They're considered to be inorganic. We have a lot of minerals, but we're going to talk about calcium, iron, magnesium, zinc, and potassium. All of them are, well, they're essential for bone and muscle strength. We use iron we need for oxygen carrying capacity in blood, and sometimes people with COPD have anemia or low blood iron, and that can affect their ability to, their oxygen carrying capacity or the ability to get adequate oxygen from the air. So we want to make sure that people with COPD are not anemic because it just makes it harder for them to breathe. We know that there are certain minerals like zinc that can help us fight infection. So like I said, there are many other minerals, but these are the ones that are important for people with COPD. And I did want to say, if you could just hold your questions till the end. People in the chat, if you want to just put them in the chat, if Julie can monitor, and then we can just answer the questions at the end. Okay, so now we're going to move on and talk about, so what do we eat? Okay, we've talked about COPD, we've talked about nutrition in a minute or two. So what do we eat? So the Dietary Guidelines for Americans used to be called the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, and they are actually developed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Department of Health and Human Services. And so the latest version is for 2020 to 2025, the latest Dietary Guidelines. And really, the idea is that the guidelines are telling us what to eat and drink to meet nutrient needs, maintain health, and prevent disease. So it's kind of like, it's like a little playbook. Like maybe I don't know where to go. Like you can go to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans and get a lot of information, or you can kind of narrow it down and get just information about one particular nutrient. So probably everybody remembers the food guide pyramid. Do you remember that? It's gone. We don't use the pyramid anymore. The first pyramid was an interesting concept, but then the second version, I don't know if you noticed it, like it was a 3D pyramid because they had steps on the side, and I couldn't understand it. My students had to explain it to me. I thought, this is way too hard. So not that I had anything to do with it, but the Dietary Guidelines came up with something a little bit more simple, and that's what we call MyPlate. And you can go to myplate.gov if you want to learn more. And we actually talked about this at lunch today. I feel like Pushta's got my cliff notes at lunch. So the idea with MyPlate is that here's our plate for our meal, and we divide our plate into 4, and half of your plate on the left should be fruits and vegetables. So a quarter would be fruits, and about a little bit more than a quarter would be vegetables. And so USDA had some catchy little phrases that we use. So it's focus on fruits is one thing. So we want to think about fruits as a part of every meal. Vary your veggies. The idea being that you want a variety of color of vegetables and kinds of vegetables. Then on the other side, the other half should be grains and proteins. So with the grains, their catchphrase is make half your grains whole grains and vary your protein routine. Maybe have meat at one meal, maybe have fish at one meal, maybe have soy or tofu. But the idea is the more we can vary the foods that we eat, the more we're likely to get all the nutrients our body needs. Up at the top, we have dairy. Dairy is on the side of the plate. And the recommendations are to move to a low-fat or dairy milk or yogurt or lactose-free. And we'll talk about some other suggestions for dairy as well. One of the interesting things that I have in my office is I actually have a little I went to a conference, they gave me a little plate that has MyPlate on it. And so it's serrated in a red ridge. So I take it into clinic with kids, and everybody wants to keep MyPlate. So they want to take it home with them. But it's a nice graphic to be able to, because it also shows an idea of what an appropriate portion size would be. I mean, that's one of the things that we see in general with kids that in my practice, where we have a lot of kids who are struggling with overweight or obesity, and they're eating healthy foods, they're just eating too much. So the idea of the MyPlate is really what's an appropriate portion size for a particular meal. And then it talks about limiting added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. And obviously we want to be active. So I think MyPlate is a nice way to give us a better picture of how we should all eat to remain healthy. So now let's tie it all together. How are we going to talk about, or what are we going to talk about specifically for people with COPD? In other words, what does the scientific evidence show? So as Pushpa mentioned, I was part of a project from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and that's the professional organization for registered dietitian nutritionists. And I'm part of their evidence analysis project. So I work, not only do I work for UF, I work for the Academy somewhat. And what they're trying to do is take all of the nutrition research that's out there, which you can imagine there's so much nutrition research going on all the time. But what would I do as a dietitian in a clinic? How would I decide what to recommend for someone with COPD when there's so much research out there? How can I narrow it down? And how can I be consistent with the other dietitians in my practice? So the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics developed an evidence analysis project where they take a topic and they pull experts together and they go through all the literature, all the information, all the good science that's out there and narrow it down to help answer some questions. So I was part of the COPD project, which was looking at nutrition guidelines for people with COPD. It started in 2019. It was a 2-year project. It actually went longer than 2 years, but that's another story. And we were looking at dietitians who worked with people with COPD. We had researchers who were doing research on people with COPD. We had individuals with COPD to help us talk about, we might say, well, we think XYZ, but I don't know. I don't have COPD. What is it like for you? How hard is it for you to get enough vitamin D? How difficult is it for you to plan your meals if you're very short of breath? It's because we needed that input from someone, a real life expert. And then we had experts in systematic reviews to help us figure out what we were doing. And again, what we wanted was the best evidence available. And I can tell you, I worked on this project from the beginning, and we started off with 18,000 papers, 18,000. So that's why it took us so long. And we have a process to go through, but it took a lot of time, but it was a really good project, and we had really good evidence. Like, I feel most proud of this particular evidence analysis project than any of the other ones I did, because it's nice when you have good research that gives you practical information, because that's what we all want to know. We want to know, what am I supposed to do? And we actually wrote a couple papers, and so I just had to put that up there because my name's on it. So if you want to, at the bottom is the reference if you ever want to pull it up and see what we did. Okay, so what did we find? What did we do? So the first thing we did was we said, okay, we got to decide what questions we want to ask. Like, there's so much information. How do we know what people want? What do we know? So we came up with some questions. The first was, does a high-fat carbohydrate or does a high-fat diet or a high-carbohydrate diet make a difference for people with COPD? What about nutrition therapy? Does seeing a dietitian make a difference? What about body weight? Is it better to be thin if you have COPD? Or maybe a little bit heavier? What are the calorie needs? How do we determine how many calories somebody with COPD needs? And then what about vitamin D? So we're going to talk about all these because we came up with answers to all the questions. The first was, what about the high carb versus the high fat diet? Just to give you a little bit of background information, well, everyone knows that, carbohydrate and fat, they're either people want you to have a high carb diet or they want you to have a higher fat diet. And things have gone back and forth over the past probably 20 or 30 years. But one of the things that people often wonder about is sometimes carbohydrates can give you more carbon dioxide in your body because it's breaking the carbons down. And so if you have a lot of carbon dioxide in your body, does that make it harder for you to breathe? And if it's harder for you to breathe when you have COPD, does the high carb diet make it worse? So we really wanted to be able to give some good recommendations. And basically what we found was the literature showed us there's no difference in lung function. So whether you're on a high carb diet or you want to be on a high fat diet, neither one seems to make a difference in lung function. So you can pick and choose which diet, or you can go somewhere in the middle. But we wanted to be able to answer that question. The second question was, does it help if you have nutrition therapy? We were hoping for a good answer on this, but we did. And we found that nutrition therapy by a registered dietitian actually found improvements in quality of life, and people who had seen a dietitian actually had an easier breathing. So they were less dyspneic or had less shortness of breath. Our next question was an interesting one, and that was, how does body weight affect longevity? Because there was some suggestion that people who were a little bit heavier seemed to do better with COPD. And that there was a term, I'm blanking on it, the obesity paradox is a term that you sometimes see in people with COPD, that people who are heavier weight, a little bit above what we would consider to be a healthy BMI, seem to have better outcomes. So again, we were able to go into the literature and found that normal to higher body weight may be more beneficial than underweight. It may be that people who are a little bit heavier have a little bit more reserve. If you're, because people with COPD are breathing harder and they're burning more calories, it's harder for them to maintain weight. So maybe being a little bit heavier has an advantage to somebody with COPD, and that's what we found. The next question came up mainly for the clinicians. Like, how do we decide what somebody's energy or their calorie needs would be? There's lots of different equations, and everybody had their own opinion about what would work best. And we decided there are many ways to determine it. And the bottom line is we need to follow somebody's body weight, right? If we want you to gain weight and we're giving you X amount of calories and you're gaining weight, we've met our goal. If we want you to gain weight and we give you extra calories and X number of calories and you're not gaining weight, then we are not meeting our goal. And so we need to increase the energy. And that just makes sense. I mean, there's no magic button that we can push that says this is exactly how many calories you're burning right now. We don't know that. Unless we're in equipment and shans in the ICU, we could probably determine that. But in general, when we're out living as, basically healthy people, it's feed somebody, see what happens, weigh them, look at how they feel. All those outcomes are really important for us. But it was really good to have the information that says there's no one particular calculation that makes that much of a difference. Okay. Oh, did I go back? I need my. Oh, so going back to the same point, we know that people with COPD generally need more calories because they're working harder to breathe. It's just like if I were to run a half marathon and I was finished and I'm really short of breath because I'm not a very good runner, I would be burning a lot of calories from breathing that hard. It's just like that with someone with COPD. The increased work of breathing increases needs, burning more calories with each breath. I've had patients come in who are breathing 40 and 50 times a minute. That's a lot of calories being burned. We're burning those calories with every breath. And some suggestions are if someone is on oxygen, that their needs may be 10 to 30% greater than people without COPD. So we have to consider when we're looking at someone's energy needs or calorie needs, what is their baseline? Are they on oxygen? What is their respiratory rate? All of those things to help us determine what would be a good match. Okay, so then the next question was, what is so important about vitamin D? We actually found some pretty good evidence that people with COPD who have lower levels of vitamin D, that would be blood levels, have more severe hospitalizations. So people who have lower levels of vitamin D, there seems to be a correlation between low levels of vitamin D and being sicker in the hospital. So the recommendations were that people with moderate to severe lung disease, we really need to look at their vitamin D levels and keep them within that normal range. Now, the reality is we all need normal vitamin D levels. I mean, that's just a standard, but particularly for people with COPD, it seems to be even more important. So let's talk about vitamin D. So the recommendations or the DRIs for vitamin D, if you're 50 to 70 years old, it's 600 IUs. And if you're greater than 70, it's 800 IUs or international units. We generally have our patients take more because they need more. We know that older adults are at greater risk for vitamin D deficiency, and D is needed for bone health, lung health, and fight infections. And we know that vitamin D is actually a hormone. So what is the vitamin that acts like a hormone? It's vitamin D, because it affects so many systems in the body. We know that people with COPD who are vitamin D deficient are much higher risk of having decreased ability to exercise and higher risk for weakness and worsening symptoms. So vitamin D deficiency can make everything worse, particularly if you have COPD. The best sources of vitamin D are like the fatty fish, such as salmon, tuna, mackerel, and fish liver oils. Fluid milk, yogurts, and ready-to-eat cereals also are fortified with vitamin D. But most people need vitamin D supplements to maintain normal vitamin D levels. We can get it from the sunlight. You would think living in Florida, we would have all this vitamin D, but the reality is most of us have low to low normal vitamin D levels. And some people have very low vitamin D levels. Okay, so that was the end of our systematic review, but some additional research has come since then, and I wanted to bring it up, and it had to do with vitamin C. So a more recent systematic review looked at vitamin C supplementation on people with COPD, and they found that vitamin C supplementation of 400 milligrams a day could increase the levels of antioxidation in the blood and improve lung function. So FEV1 and FEV1 and FVC are just lung function measures. When we do pulmonary function testing, we look at those measures. So why do we think vitamin D works this way? It's a very strong antioxidant, which may slow down lung tissue deterioration. So when we think about it, in our body, there are things called free radicals, and those just cause a lot of damage. And so the antioxidants can actually bind with the free radicals and try to keep them from causing damage. So we want those antioxidants. And vitamin C is a very strong antioxidant. The DRI, or the dietary reference intake, so what's recommended for general healthy people, is 90 milligrams a day for adult men and 75 milligrams a day for adult women for vitamin C. There is some suggestion that smoking increases metabolic turnover of vitamin C. So there's some recommendations for smokers that they should have another 35 milligrams a day of vitamin C. So this isn't something that we've worked on. We haven't had any involvement in this particular project, but I think it's something I wanted to mention because I think it's important to add the new research as well. And these are some sources of vitamin C. It's a citrus. We think of vitamin C as orange, but we also have it in strawberries, blackberries, broccoli, tomato, and lemon. And it is a water-soluble vitamin. So it's difficult to overdose with it, but I would tell you that people who take excessive amounts, like over 1,000 milligrams, may be more likely to develop kidney stones. So you don't want to overdose with vitamin C. Again, it's not going to be stored in your body, but if we can prevent kidney stones, I think that would be a good thing. Okay, so now moving on, what are some specific things that we can do to help people with COPD? Meal planning is really important. Helping people have small, frequent meals. It's easy meal prep, less work. And if they need extra calories, we try to do that from fats and protein. The idea being that small, frequent meals are probably easier for someone who's short of breath and fatigued. Fluids are really important. They always are, but particularly right now because it's so hot out. I feel like we just can't get enough fluids in. It's so hot. So water, juices, milk, whatever someone feels like they want to drink to stay hydrated. And the hydration will help the person with COPD bring up some of that mucus. It'll liquefy it and make it easier for them to clear their airways and get rid of that excess mucus. So some tips for healthy eating. People with COPD, if they're going to do airway clearance where they're going to bring up some of that mucus, do it at least an hour before eating because you really don't want to be having mucus while you're trying to eat. Eat slowly, take small bites and chew slowly, breathing deeply while chewing. Choose foods that are easy to chew. Try eating, again, those small, frequent meals 5 to 6 times a day instead of 3 large meals. Drinking liquids at the end of the meal. Drinking before or during meals might make you feel bloated or full, and then you're less likely to get the calories in that we would like you to. And some people suggest actually sitting while eating, sitting up, to ease the pressure on your lungs, although really we should be sitting when we're eating. We shouldn't be standing up. And you wouldn't want to lay down while you're eating because you're more likely to choke and aspirate. So, okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about are calorie boosters. So say we know someone with COPD needs more calories. How do we get them? There's several things that you can try. One is we use a lot of non-fat powdered milk. Not used in undiluted evaporated milk, but the non-fat powdered milk is nice because there's a lot of protein in it, and it's nice to get extra protein in. Sometimes it's hard to get a lot of protein, especially if you're used to using meats in that way. You can only chew so much meat, but you can add the non-fat powdered milk, non-fat dry milk. Cheeses are good for adding extra calories. You can melt them. Grated cheese with a sandwich, anything that someone can do to get extra calories in every bite. Again, if we're going to add extra fats, we want to use something like a vegetable oil, but certainly mayonnaise, butter, margarine, or sour cream to get extra calories in. And peanut butter. So these are just some suggestions. If you're thinking about how do I get extra calories in, these are some ways of doing it without increasing the amount of food someone's getting, but just you're getting more calories and more protein in every bite. What about oral supplements? I think we've all seen them. Maybe people are using them. High-calorie oral supplements such as Boost or Ensure, Carnation has a supplement, have been found to help or maintain weight gain during hospitalization. So people with COPD who are in the hospital oftentimes have come in, they've had an exacerbation of their COPD, they're sick, and so it's hard for them to eat. But these supplements can be helpful to help people gain or maintain their weight. We can use them at home too, but they can be costly, they're expensive. So I know that my mom spent a lot of time on using her Boost, and she maybe had 1 or 2 containers a day, especially on the days where she was just fatigued and she didn't really feel like eating, but she would drink her vanilla Boost or her chocolate Boost. And so I always felt like, she's getting some calories in, she's getting some protein, vitamins and minerals, because they all have vitamins and minerals in them too. So it made me feel good knowing that she was getting some extra nutrition. Okay, so now we're moving on to my myth or fact part. And so I'm gonna put a statement, and I want you to think, is this a myth or a fact? And you can just raise your hand or you can shout it out, and then we will talk about it. So, okay. Fluid milk causes increased mucus. It's like not a leading question or anything, right? It's a myth. Good job. It's a myth. So many times we hear, particularly in pediatrics, but probably with adults too, that they don't drink fluid milk because they feel like it gives them more mucus. And so there have been several studies that have actually looked at this, where they've given kids and adults lung function, had them drink milk, did more lung function, and we're actually looking at, was there a change in their lung function? And there has been no association between drinking fluid milk and mucus production. Still, many people with COPD avoid dairy for this reason. And we know that dairy is an important source of calcium, vitamin D, and protein. So if people are going to do what they feel is right for them. So if you do decide to avoid dairy products, make sure you get your calcium and vitamin D. There are other milks that aren't cow's milk available. There's oat milk, there's soy milk, there's almond milk. Make sure if you're going to use them, though, look on the label. Make sure that they're supplemented with vitamin D and calcium. Not all of them are. We think the reason that, I had my Mythbusters up here, that we think the reason that families believe that is that it probably tickles the back of their throat and they start coughing. And so if you've got COPD or asthma, you're going to have mucus, so you're going to start coughing up the mucus. So it may not be specifically that the dairy products are causing the mucus, but they're just tickling the back of your throat, and so you're coughing. So again, and if you decide that you don't want to use those products, that's fine. Just again, make sure you're getting a source of calcium and vitamin D. Okay, got a quiz. Why is vitamin D important? That's a good statement. For us, we say we need it for bone health, and it might help fight infections. What are some good sources of vitamin D? Sunshine's a good one. Yep, it's our sunshine vitamin. Fatty fish, liver. I don't think I talked about that before, but all the fat-soluble vitamins are stored in the liver. So if you eat liver, you're getting lots of fat-soluble vitamins. Now, most people don't like liver. Like, I like it. Like, I'm one of the weird people in my family. I like liver. Like, I grew up, we had liver a lot. But no one else in my family seems to agree with that. So and vitamin D supplements. And again, there are a lot of fortified beverages, cereals and milk that are high in vitamin D. Okay. Why do people with COPD need extra calories? Exactly, more calories to breathe. Increased work of breathing. You want to maintain your muscle strength and to fight infections. Because remember, we need to be able to fight off infections. We've got to get enough energy in to be able to have the normal day, normal way of living. Last quiz. What is the nutrient with the most calories? What nutrient has the highest calories? Fat. Good job. Right, fat at 9 calories per gram. How could we use that nutrient to help increase calories? What can we do? What can you do here? Is there something you could ask special when you have lunch or dinner? Maybe choosing things. My lunch today had a fair amount of fat, but it was tasty. So, what did I have today? I had the crepes, but I had lots of probably cheese and butter all over it. So that's something you can do. You can choose maybe an option that has a little bit more fat or a little bit more calories. It's nice because you have the option here. There's so many different choices on the menu. And so it's really thinking about what would have the higher amount of calories, protein, and fat that could help me maintain my weight. And you can add fat to soups, gravies, warm foods. So I'm just going to summarize briefly, and then we can answer questions, have any comments that you might have. So we know that proper nutrition is an important component of the treatment and management of COPD. We need balanced meals of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and we're saying about half of your diet should be from carbohydrates, 20% protein, 30% from fat. Small, frequent meals and calorie boosters can help reduce fatigue and maintain body weight. And again, we really want to maintain weight, particularly with COPD, because weight loss just brings us into a whole lot of other issues with breaking down muscle, makes it harder for you to breathe. Because remember that the diaphragm is a muscle. We need that muscle to be strong to be able to breathe. Our intercostal muscles also, we need those muscles to help us breathe and cough and clear out that mucus. Vitamins D and C are essential for lung health. Really, all of the vitamins are, and minerals, but those two seem to be a little bit highlighted in all of the vitamins and minerals we're thinking about for people with COPD. Maintain a healthy weight for optimum well-being. And I just had to put a plug in. So seek out a registered dietitian nutritionist if you want individualized nutrition recommendations. So now you get to ask me the questions. This is a nice website. It's lung.org, has some really nice information on living with COPD. There is other information as well. And I think I had the references on some of our paper and a couple other papers as well. So what time is it? So 2:15, just pretty good timing. Okay, so feel free to ask questions. Thank you again so much for asking me to speak. I've really enjoyed this, and it's such a beautiful place here.
Thank you, Ellen. This was very nice. Great. Questions?
Earlier, you said that people with COPD needed to be larger than normal, and then the last slide showed normal body weight. So how far above normal body weight is the recommendation? And is there a too far above that starts negatively impacting?
That's a really good question. So when we found all this information, it was strong. It was hard for us to figure out what to do, because it seemed like the people who were in what I hate to even say this, in the overweight range of BMI. So people who, we've got healthy weight, overweight, and obesity in the BMI ranges. And the literature showed us that people who were in that overweight range had better longevity and decreased less frequent hospitalizations. So, it kind of went against what we as dietitians believe. Everybody needs to be at the normal BMI, but this information seemed to be repeated over and over again, that probably a little bit closer to overweight, certainly not obese, because obesity, we've got a lot of adipose tissue. It's not healthy for us. There's a lot of inflammation with obesity, but someone closer to that overweight range of BMI seemed to have a little bit better outcome with COPD. Oh, there's definitely an endpoint. You definitely, yeah. I mean, I think when you look at BMI, I think healthy weight is up to 25. 25 to 29 is considered to be in the overweight range, and then 30 and above is obesity. So it was like the 25, 26, 27 BMI range is where we seem to find kind of the best outcomes. So a little bit over what we consider to be healthy. Does that answer your question? So it's hard for me to say that, because I really, it's hard for me to tell people you need to gain weight and be in the overweight range, but the information was pretty strong. So it may be that just in that weight range, if you get sick, you've got some reserve. Because if you're at a lower body weight, maybe closer to normal, and you go in the hospital and you lose 10 pounds or 15 pounds, now you're in the undernutrition, and then we're losing muscle. We're not just losing adipose, and you don't want to lose muscle when you've got COPD. You need to maintain that for health and for breathing. But great question. I was waiting for that one. I had that one.
Well, now even the BMI is under fire.
Right.
It's not being used that
Right,
much.
I know. It's really unfortunate that we use BMI, or body mass index, which is a ratio of your weight to your height, for everything. And the reality is, you're not looking at is it muscle or is it adipose tissue? It's only showing you a number. We have some teenagers that come to our clinic, and they're all from Tallahassee, and they all want to play football for FSU. I don't know why but they come, and I look at their BMI on the growth chart. I'm like, oh my gosh, this kid's obese. And I go to see him, and they're like this. They're all football players. They're all muscle. So the BMI doesn't tell us everything. So I always say to my students, look at the BMI, look at the growth, look at the patient.
Yeah.
You've got to look at all of those things.
This happened to me when I was teaching in a class of medical students and talking about BMI, and one guy asked this very same question: what about muscle versus this? Mm-hmm. And at that time it kind of floored me, because it was gospel. BMI was BMI.
Right.
Didn't matter what it was, but it makes sense to see what it is.
Right, you have to look at them too, and
Yeah.
you can usually tell seeing somebody, if they've got muscle, you can tell.
Yeah.
And if it's mostly adipose or, fat tissue, you can tell too. So,
and muscle weighs more than
right,
fat.
exactly. Yeah. So one of the things we'd like to do is, when you're looking at someone's nutritional status, is not just look at weight, to look at body fat percentage, to look at exercise, their endurance, how, can they walk across the room and not be short of breath? There are other things that we can look at besides just body weight.
Right, right. You have another question?
Yes. Sure.
I know this talk was particularly about nutrition, but do you have a website or suggestions for exercise programs? I know you talked about the intercostal muscles that are so essential. And with COPD, it's hard to move, it's hard to get going.
Right.
But if the muscle tone
you need it.
goes.
Right. Everything goes downhill. There are, we have a physical therapist and we have pulmonary rehab, but I work in pediatrics. So we have that program for kids with cystic fibrosis and other lung diseases that help do pulmonary rehab. UF probably does have a pulmonary rehab program where they have physical therapists or respiratory therapists that work specifically on the intercostals and the diaphragm to improve the strength. So I can find out more information and let you all know that, but that's a good question. That there are probably some other in town too. There are probably some pulmonary rehab. And that could be something that once they, you could go, they could tell you what to do, and, you could be monitored rather than, because it makes a difference, I think.
Yeah. Do we have other questions?
I have one.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Julie.
On the MyPlate diagram,
Mhm.
I didn't see carbs. So how do you,
Well, their carbs are in our grains.
okay,
And our
in the
vegetables. So it was divided in a different way.
Mhm.
So, fruits, vegetables, grains all have carbohydrates.
Okay.
So it's the macronutrients are kind of all thrown together. Protein was separate and fats were at the bottom, but that's a good question. It's a little confusing. Good question.
so we can still have our carbs?
Absolutely.
Do we have any on the Zoom?
I don't see any
questions
behind you there. There's one.
Yeah.
Anne-Marie likes to ask questions. That's good.
Thank you for a very good, very informative presentation. I'm wondering about serving sizes as people get older, whether or not that changes, because I'm having a hard time keeping up with 5 servings of fruit and vegetables a day when they're, I don't know, half a cup apiece or whatever.
That's a good question. It is really hard. It's filling. You can, well, first of all, the serving sizes are pretty standard, and we use the palm of your hand as an example of serving sizes. So for example, like you want like half a banana, or like your serving size for a banana is half a banana. So, a standard banana, or like a handful of grapes. So we call it the handy portions idea. So like even like for like a protein, like if you were going to have a chicken breast, like the idea is it would be like the size of your palm of your hand. So you probably are getting 5 servings. You probably are just not, you probably don't realize it, is what I would say. Now you can also mix that up and have, juice is something that may not be quite as filling. So you could get some fruits in that way. I mean, I'll be honest with you. It's hard for me to get 5 servings of fruits and vegetables every day. I try, but some days it just doesn't happen. One of the things that one of my students told our patients, which I thought was a really good idea, is if you're into meal planning, we don't at our house, we aren't that ahead of actually planning meals on a daily basis. I would like that to happen, but we just haven't gotten that far yet. But if you are into meal planning and you've got a menu, then my student said, so look at each particular meal. Is there a way you could add a fruit there? Could you add a vegetable? And see if there's a way you could add it in, maybe it's, some apple, or maybe it's a little container of mandarin oranges, or some way to add in some extra fruits and vegetables, which don't cause you a lot more time cooking or preparing. But it's a good question.
Any more questions? Yeah, Nancy, sure. Why not?
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any foods that are particularly bad to eat for COPD?
Yeah, what we try to do is, we try to stay away from good and bad. I know, but that's just things to be avoided, maybe is what you're asking. I think what we want to try to avoid are processed foods in general. I mean, it's really easy to get something out of the cabinet and use it. But really the idea is if we can take foods in their more natural form, and if we can have things from scratch, I think one of the things that we see in those processed foods is a lot of sodium. And I didn't talk about that at all, but that's one of the things that people with COPD oftentimes have to limit. And there's a lot of sodium in frozen foods. There's a lot of sodium in processed foods. So the more natural we can have our foods, or whole foods is something we talk about, is just in general better. You're going to get more fiber, you're going to get more protein, you're going to get vitamins and minerals. So try to avoid the processed foods. So that, like I said, the things like, again, here you guys have the option of really good meals, and they probably aren't using a lot of processed foods, but maybe the lower sodium option. What I'm thinking, like where you go, the hamburger helper, or the frozen dinners that have tremendous amounts of sodium in them, and it's pretty well processed. There's probably not a lot of vitamins and minerals in those foods.
But is sodium really bad for you unless you have high blood pressure?
That's a good question. Is sodium really bad for you unless you have high blood? We don't really know. There is some thought that in general we just eat more sodium than we need, and maybe it's harder on our kidneys. I don't know. That's a good question.
Okay, you had mentioned using peanut butter.
Mm-hmm.
read the labels, because some brands are full of sugar, and you really have to, and you can, at least I can tell that if you look at the grams of protein, because some really have a lot of protein compared to, I guess, the cheaper ones that have a lot more sugars.
No, that's a really good point. And I didn't talk about label reading, but that's important. I mean, certainly with because some of those peanut butters are just filled with all kinds of fillers and additives. You really want to get more the natural ones where the oil separates, even though it's a pain and you have to mix it together. It's a healthier kind of peanut butter, but that's a good point.
Thank you for the talk. It was just very interesting. What do you think about protein powders to gain calories and protein?
So a lot of people use protein powders. I think that there's a place for them. One of the things they're expensive. So that's one of the things, those containers are expensive. But if you need extra protein, they're a pretty good source. Some people recommend the pea protein powder. There's different kinds, and that's probably one of the better ones. My only concern is that make sure in the label they often add in a lot of other things in those protein powders, because they can, sometimes they're designed or they're aimed at bodybuilders. And so they'll add in a lot of extra things that they think bodybuilders want. Like sometimes they'll add caffeine. I've seen other things added. So you just make sure you read the label and make sure that there's not a lot of additives in them. I went to Walmart one day to get protein powder, and I was shocked by what was there. There's so many out there. And again, there seems to be this niche for bodybuilders. They'll have creatine in it, and we just don't need all of that unless we want to be bodybuilders. And I don't think we're at this point, that's what we really want. We want it as simple as possible. And non-fat dry milk will work the same way. I mean, there's protein to that too.
I have another question that it really doesn't have to do with COPD, but I noticed about 10 years ago that we used to have recommendations about using iodized salt, and that people were talking about how it was protective against thyroid disease, and I have not heard anything about this since. I wonder if there's been a change in terms of, do you know anything about that?
I don't, but I think most salts have iodine in them now. I think it's just a standard. They all, I think it might be, I don't know, this is my personal opinion, I have to check, but I think most salts have iodine in them. And so it's rare to find a salt without. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that was just a standard.
I've looked on labels and I'm buying iodized salt, but I have a friend with thyroid cancer and she says, oh, my doctor didn't even answer that question.
I don't know.
That's why I'm asking.
But I'm not a thyroid expert, so
Some salts that don't have added iodine, like sea salt, but that's already got iodine on its own, so it may not state it.
But it hasn't.
Right.
I think it would be hard to find salt without that nowadays, here in this country, is my guess.
Well, any more questions? This has been a very lively. We have one more? Sure. Why not? We still have.
So thinking about portions, you used the hand, but you also said that fruit juices could be part of that. Obviously,
That's a good question.
you're not going to
No,
use a handful.
No. So actually, the serving size for fruit juice is a quarter of a cup. A quarter of a cup. Quarter of a cup. So, and who drinks a quarter of a cup of juice? So that's one of the areas that you can get a lot of fruits in. The issue is there's a fair amount of sugar there too. But that's something that I think most people don't know, that that's the serving size. Right. Who drinks a quarter of a cup? Right. We have a problem with kids that way drinking, like they love their orange juice or their grape juice or apple juice, and it's healthy for them, but they're getting a ton of sugar and a lot of calories.
So grape juice would count? Red wine?
I'm far be it for me to tell someone not to drink wine. But, the grape juice you have to be careful with, though, because it can interact with a lot of medications. So grapefruit juice. I'm sorry. Did I say grape juice? No, grapefruit juice. Yeah, grape juice is fine. There's no interaction with that. But grapefruit juice, just in general, just be aware of the certain heart medicines.
Statins.
Right. So, yeah.
Well, on that happy note with wine in our diet, I want to thank you, Ellen, for coming. It's really appreciate the effort you've made. I hope to see you again.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
It's nice meeting you. Hey, Julie. She's got her mic off. Turn your mic on, Julie, for a sec.
Hi.
My student's here. Okay. Thanks for joining. Yes. Yeah, my
It
student.
was great.
Can you put your picture on? Can we see you? You might not be able to. We lost her. Okay. Oh, well, anyway, so she's my new tutor. Hi, how are you?